Okay, I know this isn't a good angle, but you know, you got to record where you can. And we have a super long, let me see if I can move this back. A super long, or move it up. No, it's really weird. I got to find something to set this on. Oh, maybe I can set it on this book to make it a little higher. But we've got a really long chapter to cover in the problem of political authority. We were doing what if there was no authority, and God, if I remember, that was like 50-60 pages. So I might break this into, well, I'm definitely going to break the recording into parts. Whether I break the upload into parts is another story altogether, another matter altogether. But this was a great chapter. It's where I had some very fundamental disagreements with him, but in the disagreements, I thought it was a very fruitful way to pursue discussions with people who may not have a deontological outlook, that might have more of just a pragmatic outlook. So I just want to read the introductory paragraphs here, because it sets up the whole long chapter. Again, chapter 7, what if there is no authority? It said, if there is no authority, does it follow that we ought to abolish all governments? No. The absence of authority means roughly that individuals are not obligated to obey the law merely because it is the law, and that agents of the state are not entitled to coerce others merely because they are agents of the state. What a profound, simple statement. That so much is packed into that. There might still be good reasons to obey most laws, and agents of the state might still have adequate reasons for engaging in enough coercive action to maintain a state. If the arguments of the preceding chapters are correct, the ones we've already gone over, the circumstances and purposes that would justify coercion on the part of the state are just the circumstances and purposes that would justify coercion on the part of private agents. And it's so easy to get lost in the big picture, but that is, like, if you had to do the ultra sparks note of his points so far, is the state doesn't have any special authority. There might be a duty to obey. There might be a right to coerce. But to the extent that they exist to everybody, not just the state. Let me find it here. It remains to be seen whether some organizations are justified in engaging in enough state-like activities to qualify as states. In the terminology of contemporary political philosophy, I have so far defended philosophical anarchism, the view that there are no political obligations. But I have yet to defend political anarchism, the view that government should be abolished. And I've never really thought of those two distinctions before. I have between practical anarchism and philosophical anarchism. Like, I'm definitely a philosophical anarchist, but whether or not it's actually possible, I've always been agnostic about. I've always felt it was ideal. He takes it in a little bit of a different direction. And then he notes at a footnote, though I have followed the established terminology here, it should be noted that the terminology is misleading, since it falsely suggests that one of the doctrines is philosophical but not political, while the other is political but not philosophical. In fact, both kinds of anarchism are philosophical and political. So that's why I like philosophical and practical better. It says the aim of this present chapter is to discuss the practical implications of a philosophical but not a political anarchism. So in my terminology, it would be of the belief that this is ideal, but not really whether it's practical or can be done or to what extent it can be done. That is, suppose one accepts the arguments of the preceding chapters, but one believes, contrary to the arguments to follow in later chapters, that government is necessary to a decent society. In that case, what practical conclusions should one draw? And I guess then now he's kind of overlapping with my practical distinction. So how would I distinguish here? I think what he's trying to say is, okay, well, I guess he is following my distinctions here. He's saying, so you're a philosophical anarchist. Great. What practically does this mean? Though later, I guess he takes it farther into political anarchism. I might need to revisit my terminology and start adopting his terminology, because there's a weird overlap here that I can see he's covering an area that I don't. I think we both agree on philosophical anarchism, but he is saying your philosophy should have... I think I know where I can distinguish here. So say we're all philosophical anarchists. Certainly we believe some of that is possible. And that's what he's calling practical. And then when he is moving on later to political anarchism, he is advocating for the realization of it, the fact that it is possible to fully realize and that it would be a good thing. We'll see whether this parsing out that I just did works. All right, we'll continue this in a bit. So he starts with some policy implications and says if there's no political authority, then the vast majority of laws are unjust. We know that, don't we? Because they deploy coercion against individuals without adequate justification. This is where he and I start to disagree, depending on how you define coercion. I don't think there is justification. There could be mitigation, but not justification. So he gives some examples that I think we agree with that I don't need to belabor. Prostitution and legal moralism, drugs and paternalism. And I like the comment, I just highlighted one comment under drugs and paternalism. The desire to prevent people from damaging their own lives in these ways does not constitute adequate grounds for coercion. And then the next section is rent seeking, and I decided to highlight the definition of that because I don't think this is a concept. I think probably libertarians understand it pretty well, but perhaps not. He just defines it very simply as rent seeking is behavior designed to extract wealth from others, especially through the vehicle of the state, without providing compensatory benefits in return. Okay, now there's an extensive section on immigration that I actually do want to read aloud. It says, immigration. Marvin is in need of food, without which he will suffer from malnutrition or starvation. He plans to travel to a nearby marketplace where he will be able to trade for food. But before he can reach the marketplace, he is accosted by Sam, who does not want Marvin to trade in the marketplace for two reasons. First, Sam's daughter is going to be shopping in the marketplace, and Sam fears that Marvin might bid up the price of food. Some vendors might even run out of bread if too many people come to the marketplace. Second, Marvin comes from a different culture for most people presently at the marketplace, and Sam fears that Marvin might influence other people and thus alter the culture of the marketplace. Sam decides to solve the problem by force. He points his gun at Marvin and orders Marvin to turn around. The starving Marvin is thus forced to return home empty-handed. Sam's reasons for coercing Marvin in this story are clearly inadequate. He gets into a lot as to when he thinks coercion is justified, and we're not talking about just in defense of self. That's one thing that truly troubles me about this book. But I understand a lot of people will come to that conclusion. It's just surprising that an anarchist does. But anyway. Furthermore, Sam will be culpable for whatever harms Marvin suffers as a result of being unable to reach the marketplace. Trying to find my spot here. They will be harms that Sam inflicted upon Marvin. If Marvin starves to death, then Sam will have killed him. This is true even though Sam was not responsible for Marvin's initial situation of being hungry and out of food. It is true because Sam actively prevented Marvin from obtaining more food. And I agree with all of this. If a person is starving and you refuse to give him food, then you allow him to starve. But if you take the extra step of coercively interfering with his obtaining of food from someone else, and I would say someone else who is willing to sell to him, then you do not merely allow him to starve, you starve him. The same point applies to lesser harms. If, for example, Marvin merely suffers malnutrition as a result of being able to reach the marketplace, Sam will have inflicted this harm upon him. The behavior of Sam in the story is analogous to that of the government of any modern country that excludes poor immigrants. Potential immigrants from developing nations come to participate in the marketplace of wealthier countries. And this is going to hit home with a lot of people. This is an argument for immigration. It's why I'm an open borders person. I understand probably many people listening to this are not. I just hope that you take this into consideration, and perhaps, even though you may have started out nodding your head that there is no justification for coercion as we normally define it, you may now be modifying your opinion or trying to find a way that this isn't really coercion. The governments of wealthier countries routinely forcibly exclude those potential immigrants. As a result, many suffer greatly diminished life prospects. The government does not merely allow harms to befall these would-be immigrants. If the government merely stood by passively and refused to give aid to potential immigrants, then it would be allowing harms to occur. But it does not stand by passively. The government of every wealthy country in the world deliberately hires armed guards to forcibly exclude or expel unwanted persons. This coercive intervention constitutes an active infliction of harm upon them, just as Sam inflicts harm on Marvin in this story. The most common reasons given for immigration restriction are twofold. First, new immigrants compete with existing Americans in the labor market, thus driving down wages for unskilled labor and making it more difficult for American workers to find jobs. Second, that if too many immigrants enter the country, they will alter the country's culture. The first concern is analogous to Sam's concern about Marvin's competing with Sam's daughter in the marketplace. It is not permissible to use force against another person simply to prevent a third party from suffering economic disadvantage through normal marketplace competition. The second concern is analogous to Sam's concern about the culture of the marketplace. It is not permissible to use force against another person simply to prevent that person from influencing the culture of one society in undesired ways. And I do think that is two of the major reasons, but I think he skipped one. And that might be the one more persuasive to my particular audience, so he might get into it later in the book. And that is that everyone who is already here pays into services, such as roads, such as schools, such as hospitals, things like that. And that people who have not paid into it come in and take advantage of that. And that is a form of theft. I don't buy that argument. I've dealt with that in multiple podcasts. Perhaps I'll do another one on it. But I just wanted to, excuse me. I've been very sick. But I can't seem to get this frog ribbit out of my throat. But I did want to acknowledge that I think he ignored a third reason, which to many people is the most weighty reason. But I do think he adequately dealt with the first two. Okay, I think as you guys can tell, it's getting cold here in Colorado. I'm getting ready to take off. I had done the prior videos on breaks, so I've got my cute little pink jacket on, but Let's continue for a little bit. This is such a long chapter that I'm catching as catch can. So we covered immigration, but then he continued with some other just broad topics, such as the protection of individual rights, taxation and government finance. But we're gonna linger a moment, shall we, on taxation and government finance. We're gonna linger more than a moment, I think. You know how much I love taxation. All right, it says, there's an inference that seems to presuppose that individuals are justly entitled prima facie to their pre-tax incomes. I certainly have that presupposition. Thomas Nagel and Liam Murphy have disputed this assumption. I think there is somebody on earth that will dispute that the sky is blue. They believe that property rights are created by governmental laws. Interesting. And therefore, one only has property rights in those things to which the state laws grant one ownership. So, if the people just decided that nothing belonged to you anymore, then nothing belongs to you anymore. Interesting. By creating tax laws, the state shapes the property rights that individuals have such that individuals only own their after-tax incomes. So basically, you are a slave. That's what these people are arguing. I wish we would stop sugarcoating what they are arguing. In response, there are three views one might hold regarding property rights. First, one might hold that property rights are natural, and that's what I hold, by the way. That is, moral rights that exist prior to the state. John Locke, for example, held that individuals are justly entitled to the fruits of their labor, even in a pre-governmental society. On this view, taxation would seem to be a prima facie injustice, for whatever the ethically correct way of acquiring property may be, it presumably is not forcible extraction of goods held by others. Second, and I don't object to this second one because I think, at least I don't agree with how he casts it. Second, one might hold that property rights are partly natural and that there are certain broad principles of property that are valid independent of governmental laws, but that there are many details of a regime of property rights that are not settled by these general moral principles. He's going to get into some examples, but that's where custom comes in, not government. That doesn't mean that the rights aren't natural. It means that they need to be discovered within a natural context. And that while the broad concept is natural, the varying situations are varying. I know that was almost like obvious troll is obvious, but it reminds me of a misunderstanding people have with situational ethics. And they say that situational ethics have to do with you would behave differently in a different situation, but that's not what situational ethics are. It doesn't deal with relative situations. It deals with relative people, that in the exact same situation, morality would depend upon the person who is the actor. That is what is wrong. As long as the claim is that every human actor has the same ethics in certain varying situations, that is not relativism. To me, there seems to be a little bit of a confusion here, but he's the philosopher, not me. That's how I understand it. So he continues, perhaps our inherent moral rights determine that we are justly entitled to the fruits of our labor, but those rights do not determine at what altitudes one may fly one's airplane over someone else's land. True. That isn't settled through obvious appeals to nature. One might hold that state-created laws are needed to settle such matters of detail. No, there isn't. There were things like that. There were understandings of property boundaries, not airplanes and things like that, even in the wild, wild west. You can't piss into the Atlantic Ocean and say you mixed your entire labor with the entire ocean and claim you own it. So there's an obvious example where everyone would agree. It's at the margins that things can get gray, and societal custom settles it. Now that custom may become codified into law, but that doesn't mean the law settled it. This view still offers little comfort to a defender of taxation, for the entitlement of one agent to coercively extract vast quantities of resources from the rest of the population is not the sort of matter of detail, like the altitude at which one may overfly others' property, that is possibly taken to be left indeterminate by the basic moral principles of property. And he certainly has that right. Third, one might hold that there are no natural property rights. Nagel and Murphy assume that this means that property rights are created by governmental decree. What created the governmental decree? This is plausible only for one who presupposes a strong doctrine of political authority. I think Hoppy's, and I'm not a big fan of Hoppy, but I am a big fan of this, argumentation ethics come into play here. Nagel and Murphy ascribe to the state a moral entitlement. From whence does it come? Arising from its power to create property rights. How does it have any power independent of the individual people? And if the individual people can create property rights, then they inherently and naturally have property rights. To coercively enforce its chosen distribution of resources. Since no non-governmental agent may declare a distribution of resources and a regime of property rights and then coercively enforce them, the state's right to do so would require political legitimacy. At the same time, the state's creation of a regime of property rights would presumably impose obligations on the part of citizens to respect that regime. These would be political obligations. If, therefore, the state has no authority, it has no such power of creating property rights as Murphy and Nagel suppose. The result would seem to be that even after the state has made its laws, there are still no property rights. If one finds this conclusion implausible, one ought to return to the view that there are natural property rights. One might think that the rejection of property rights leaves the way open for taxation, since taxpayers have no right to their wealth. The seizure of some of that wealth will no longer appear as a rights violation. But by that same token, the state will have no right to that wealth either. Right, if there are no property rights, no one has them. Why is the state this special creature that has it? And thus citizens do no wrong by withholding it. Meanwhile, there are the harms that the state coercively imposes on those who fail to pay taxes, and these would seem to be prima facie injustices. In short, the defender of taxation must hold that the state, rather than the taxpayers, is justly entitled to the tax revenues that the state collects. There is no plausible way to defend this view unless one assumes a doctrine of political authority. Okay, some individuals, when first exposed to this idea, think that the proposal amounts to coercive. Okay, I'm sorry, I need to back up because I seem to have skipped something here. It is talking about the state charging fees for services rather than taxation. I know that's a popular libertarian solution, and it might be better than what we have now if people could compete with the state. But then it's no longer a state. It's just another business. I'm sure he'll get into that later. But now that you see, he's talking about fees for services. So some individuals, when first exposed to this idea, think the proposal amounts to coercive taxation of funds from citizens, just as surely as taxation does. For individuals who did not pay the state's fees would be subject to a serious risk of violence. This is a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake. I think that is exactly what it is. Under the present taxation scheme, the state itself inflicts harm on those who fail to pay their taxes. Okay, I'll leave my rebuttal alone for a minute. Under the fee-for-service scheme I have proposed, the state fails to protect from harm those who refuse to pay the necessary fee, but it does not itself inflict harm on them. But if we go back to that other example about the marketplace in Marvin, the state does inflict harm upon them if the state enforces a monopoly. Sure, If there's competition and you don't pay the fee to the state, they don't have to provide you services. But if they prohibit others from providing you those services, then yes, they have surely inflicted harm on you in the same way that was given in that immigration example. Under the fee-for-service scheme I've proposed, we did this. Consider an analogy. Doctors provide medical care for a price. They usually do not provide care to those who do not pay them, but they are not coercing everyone who does not buy their service. If you do not hire a doctor will not come and infect you with a disease. But if that doctor prevents you from seeing a different willing doctor, they are as guilty by his own example. I'm sure such an obvious, contradiction within pages of himself will be addressed later, because he's a brilliant thinker. He's just not doing it here, but it is just so glaring to me. This fee for service, and he might get into it later. It's been a while since I've read this chapter, but you're almost like getting my contemporaneous reaction. This fee-for-service model of government finance is like the system in which doctors provide medical care only to those who hire them. The taxation system is like a system in which doctors give diseases to those who don't hire them. Oh, okay, he does deal with it. All right, well, at least you saw that I was thinking in the right direction. Another question is whether the state would be entitled to prohibit non-state individuals or organizations from selling services similar to those of the state. For instance, could private security companies provide security for people who did not pay the government's fees? If such competition were allowed, many citizens might opt for private security, perhaps to save money or to obtain better service. If enough people behaved in this way, the government could conceivably be driven out of business. In my view, such competition should be allowed, and this provides the key to the political anarchist proposal of later chapters. Okay, so he did anticipate my objection. But without anticipating that objection, not a page and a half later, but within this argument I gave before, his analogy was extraordinarily flawed and very obvious to me. However, this present chapter is for those who believe that any scheme of competing security provision with no single central authority would be socially disastrous. On that assumption, the state could justly prohibit private provision of security. But if it did so, it would be killing people, just like Marvin would be. Who was the guy who was preventing Marvin? I forgot, but was just as guilty of starving him, because he prohibited his access to the market for reasons that he thought legitimate. It is normally wrong to coerce others, but such coercion can be justified when it is necessary to prevent something much worse from happening. That's my fundamental disagreement with this author. I do not believe that. I don't think libertarianism and morality are coextensive. It might be moral to do that. You might be considered a mitigation in some kind of lawsuit, and probably a jury of your peers would never convince you. But it is not just. You do not have a right to do it. You could be forgiven of it, and perhaps you should. But it is not a right you have. There are no brakes on this thing. A similar point would apply if it turned out that the fee-for-service model of government finance was, for some reason, unworkable. If taxation were necessary to prevent a societal catastrophe, then the state would be justified in taxing. No, it wouldn't. And I don't believe that's the case, and neither does he. I think it would be I think he and I both agree that coercion is wrong. So it would be a very odd world. And, as a religious person, I do believe there's a guiding hand in this world, that doing the right thing would lead to social catastrophe. However, the fee-for-service model, if workable, has the advantage in terms of justice, since it reduces the amount of government coercion. For this reason, governments ought at least to attempt to implement this model and should resort to taxation only if serious, good faith efforts at voluntary financing fail. And if you allow the government to determine whether it's been a good faith effort and whether it failed, since taxation is in their interest, since it lines the pockets of the elites, they will always find that it fails. All right, we still got quite a bit to go, but so far an interesting discussion. Okay, I'm back with a little bit of problem with political authority. Really, I'd hoped to record some more, but life and the LNC got in the way. That's just what happened. So we have next the case of aid to the poor. And here's, again, you know, I've had a lot of and I'm sorry the lighting is just not so good here. I'm going to have to work on that. It's just, there's a beautiful view I have, but I should show it to you. Maybe we will in the final video, but the lighting in the morning's kind of weird. So he has the case of aid to the poor, and I know I've had a lot of disagreements with him in this chapter, and that's okay. I would guess that most people, your average person, not most libertarians, but even people with libertarian leanings, would probably disagree with me on this. I do not think coercion is ever justified. It doesn't mean it gets into the situation of are there mitigating factors? Can it be excused? Can it be forgiven? Should it be forgiven? What are the moral implications? But when we're talking about strict justice, which is what libertarian theory is, I do not believe coercion is ever justified. This author does. So he's in arguing against welfare, which is great, he uses examples, and my hair is like, I could see where some, you know, when you dye your hair, you have breakage. Sorry, ADHD. He argues against welfare by showing cases in which you can coerce to help people. So an example he gives is welfare and drowning children, where he talks about if there's, I'm going to be paraphrasing, a drowning child that you can't personally help, but there is somebody nearby who can, and you know that they can, and you know with near absolute certainty if they do, they will rescue that drowning child, but they're not willing to. It is acceptable for you to coerce that person to do so. I do not believe that's justified. Does that mean I wouldn't do it? That's an interesting question. I don't think any of us can answer those questions when we're not in that situation, but I would still not be justified. Now, a jury or whatever kind of justice system there is might just give you a slap on the wrist and say, we understand why, what were the damages to this other person, so on and so forth. But it wasn't okay. I'm going to need to think of a much more concise way to express this, but I think most of you know what I'm talking about, even those of you who disagreed. Morality is not quite the same as justice. I think morality is more merciful, I guess is the way it is. I don't know. Morality is much more broader, and there is some subjectivity in it, whether people like that or not. There's obviously some hardcore objective realities. This is something I definitely need to explore more. But in giving this example of the drowning child, he says, this appears to show that it is permissible to coerce others to assist those in distress, provided that they can do so at a modest cost. Well, what's a modest cost to them? Like, there's factors you don't know. Like in this case, how do you not know that this person doesn't have some kind of weird phobia of water, that even though they can swim and they can rescue this child, that this won't traumatize them for the rest of their lives? I mean, we're dealing with hypotheticals here, but still. And that there is no other way of causing the people in distress to be helped. By analogy, one may argue the state is justified in using coercion to induce citizens to aid the poor, as in the case of government social welfare programs. And then he goes on to object to that conclusion, the conclusion of government welfare, because of the reasons he laid out for why it would be justified in the case of the drowning child, because it's not a modest cost, because there are other ways, and the outcome is pretty certain. So he argues that anti-poverty programs in a utilitarian manner are not very effective. Therefore, there is a presumption against coercion. He gets into this in great depth. I highly recommend reading this part of the book if you're interested in that. He said, given the presumptions against coercion, the programs are justified only if it is clear that they have a net positive expected benefit. And he goes into all the unintended negative consequences of anti-poverty programs. And there is a section where it says, are poverty programs properly targeted? It's a small chapter, but it is so good that I want to read it in full. It's only 3 pages, and I'm going to do that in the next section. But that's on page 152 of the book. But it really, really is good and thought-provoking. Okay, back to a normal recording setting. And I think I'm going to stop trying to do any recordings on breaks at work, because the lighting, the sound, everything's not great. But back. And I know putting these all together gets a little bit awkward, but this is how we're doing it, at least this time. So I had said there was a whole chapter that I wanted to read, and I think it's important to do. And I'm just taking a little bit of a look ahead, because I don't think there's terribly that much more we're going to be covering in full, but this was a super, super long chapter. Oh my goodness. Okay, so are poverty programs properly targeted? He says, I turn now to another variation on the needy children theme. Call this the cold child case. There is a child who is uncomfortable because of the cold night air. She needs a jacket, but you have no jacket to give her. You do, however, have a gun, and you see a bystander who is wearing both a jacket and a sweater. The bystander does not want to give up any of his clothing. You pull out your gun and compel the bystander to give his jacket to the girl. Meanwhile, farther away, there's a boy who is drowning in a shallow pond. You are aware of this second child, and you could coerce the bystander to help with the drowning child. However, this would interfere with his helping the cold child. The bystander has to leave shortly for very important reasons and only has time to help one child. What's interesting here is if you're going to be using a gun to compel the bystander, you could keep him from leaving for his very important reasons. But let's ignore that. I think he kind of missed that flaw right here. You like the cold child better. She looks more like you. She's from your hometown and so on. So you secure help for the cold child, leaving the other child to drown. Your behavior in this case is morally unacceptable. There are 2 obvious problems. Well, to me, there's one obvious problem. You don't get to pull a gun on somebody and force them to help other people. But first, the desire to keep a child warm is, in the absence of a medical emergency, not an adequate justification for armed robbery. Second, if you are going to use coercion to help someone, it has to be the drowning child, whose needs are far more urgent. The government of a wealthy nation is in a similar position. Some of its citizens are somewhat needy, but there are much needier citizens in other countries. The American poor, for example, are only poor relative to other Americans. They often nevertheless own automobiles, color televisions, microwave ovens, and so on. They may be in danger of, for example, being unable to afford new clothes or being unable to send their children to college. The poor in the developing world, however, are absolutely poor. They are in danger of dying because of starvation, malnutrition, or easily preventable diseases. Yet, for the most part, the governments of wealthy countries, such as the United States, choose to use their funds to aid people in their own countries, mostly ignoring the much needier people elsewhere. The 2 activities are related because the funds that are spent on domestic poor could have been spent on foreign poor. The state could, of course, raise its tax rates so that to have more money available. But no matter how high the state raised its revenues within the range of plausible possibilities, it would still be the case that all or nearly all of that money would have to be spent on the foreign poor if funds were allocated in anything like a need-based manner. As in the case of the cold child, most actual government wealth redistribution programs appear to suffer from two problems. First, the needs they aim to address are not sufficiently urgent to justify coercion. The need to save a person from death or serious injury may justify a moderate level of coercion and moderate violations of property rights. But the desire to supply a person with quality clothing, a college education, or an air conditioner typically does not suffice to justify coercive seizure of the necessary funds from innocent third parties. Second, if the government is to institute coercive aid programs at all, it surely must direct its efforts towards people whose lives are in grave danger, yet who could be saved at minimal cost, rather than toward people with much less urgent needs that are much more expensive to address. For example, it has been estimated that programs of vitamin A supplementation in the developing world can save lives at a cost of between $64 and $500 per life saved. For comparison, when performing cost-benefit analysis in the U.S., the U.S. EPA uses a figure of $6.9 million for the value of a statistical life in the United States. The government could give its anti-poverty funds to charity groups implementing extremely cost-effective, life-saving programs in less developed countries. Surely programs of this kind must come before giving money to an American family whose income, while low by American standards, is many times greater than most inhabitants of the developing world. Some would argue that the state's seemingly perverse priorities are justified because the state bears special responsibilities to its own citizens that it does not bear to foreigners. This strikes me as an inadequate reply. Suppose we add to the cold child case the stipulation that the cold child is actually your daughter, whereas the drowning child is a stranger from some other country. If governments have special duties to their own citizens, parents have even clearer and stronger special duties to their own children. So if it were a question of saving one of the two children's lives, it would be proper to save your daughter. But you may not choose securing a jacket to keep your daughter warm over saving the life of a stranger. The argument of this subsection does not attempt to show that no coercive anti-poverty programs could be justified. What it shows is that if the state is morally justified in adopting any such programs, they would have to be very different from the programs actually found in wealthy countries. They would focus on extremely needy, yet easily helped people in foreign countries. Existing programs are almost entirely aimed at the wrong people and the wrong programs. Now, as I said, I have problems with this all around in that I don't agree with his argument for justified coercion. But he's taking those presuppositions, and a lot of people do hold those presuppositions, and dismantling them. And I think dismantling them very well. All right. And then, he continues on. Again, this isn't meant to be a recapitulation of the whole book, but a highlights. So, he talks about, but what about the just following orders objection? That government agents are blameless or morally justified, or justified, because he doesn't use the same terminology as I do between morality and justification. But what about the culpability of government agents? So he says, as a rule, the fact that government employees believe themselves to be acting rightly makes them less blameworthy than they would otherwise be. It does not render them completely blameless. They may still be blameworthy if, as is probably the case, they have not exercise sufficient effort to find out where their true moral duty lies. In any case, government's employees' ignorance of their ethical duty does not alter the appropriate assessment of what they really ought to do. It does not alter the fact that they have no right to enforce unjust laws. And lest anyone think that he's trying to say that, in an extreme example, you know, like in the Nuremberg trials, that the just following orders would make them less blameworthy, he would say it takes no investigation at all to know that murdering people is wrong. He's speaking of lesser evils here. It says implications for private citizens. And then in praise of disobedience, not disobedience as in the act, but disobedience as in the actors. If there is no authority, then disobedience to government edicts is justified far more often than is generally recognized. I agree. He says, to submit to a bully's demands is at best excusable. And he's using the Sam, the vigilante neighbor example again. He says, to defy Sam privately would be perfectly acceptable. To defy Sam publicly would be a praiseworthy act of courage. Similarly, there is no question of its being wrong to defy unjust laws. The only ethical question is whether defiance is obligatory or supererogatory. In view of the severity and credibility of the threats commonly issued by the state to lawbreakers, I believe that in most cases defiance of unjust laws is supererogatory, and I agree with him there. In some cases, defiance is foolhardy, as it would be foolhardy when a mugger points a gun at you to refuse to hand over your wallet, but it is not ethically wrong. And then he addresses the issue of violent resistance, which is a super important question, which of course, as a pacifist, I have an entirely different reasons, well, maybe not entirely different reasons, but I have my own reasons for opposing. But he says, in order to assess violent resistance, let's look at some general principles governing the defensive use of force. 1. The use of force is justified only when necessary to prevent some serious wrong. That is, there must be no alternatives available that would prevent the wrong without using comparable levels of force, committing some other equally serious prima facie wrong, or demanding unreasonable sacrifices of the agent. Number 2, the use of force must have a reasonable chance on the agent's evidence of preventing the wrong from occurring. Unless this condition is satisfied, the use of force will not count as a defensive measure. It may instead count as a retaliatory measure, however. The conditions for justified retaliatory force are beyond the scope of this discussion. 3. The expected harm caused by the use of force may not be out of proportion to the expected harm averted. For example, it is not permissible to kill another person merely to prevent that person from stealing your stereo. It would, however, be permissible to kill a person necessary to prevent that person from seriously injuring you. And 4, it is usually not permissible to harm innocent third parties in the course of defensive violence. Some harm to innocent third parties can sometimes be justified, but this will generally require expected benefits much greater than the expected harms. Believe it or not, I agree with him in number 4, but not in the examples he gave before. And I would nuance it differently. So I'm going to stop talking about the book right here, but explain that point where it talks about harm to an innocent third party. And I draw from Walter Block in this example when he talks about a human shield. If somebody is using a human shield and they are lethally threatening you and you believe they are going to kill you unless you shoot them, but the only way you can shoot them is through the human shield, are you committing aggression against the human shield if you do that? When there is no doubt that person will be killed. Are you the murderer? Or is the person using the human shield? And I would say that the action that led to that is the person using the human shield. You are defending yourselves. The murderer is the person who put that person in that position to begin with. that is way beyond, at least so far, the discussion of his book. But I just wanted to give an example of why, in some cases, I would agree with that fourth point. I would not agree with that fourth point when it comes to the examples that he gave. Though I think a moral, I think it would be immoral if somebody could, at minimal cost to themselves, not save a drowning child for them not to do it, and they should deserve all of the social approbation and scorn and shunning, but you can't force them. That's where he and I disagree, but I recognize that most people would probably agree with him. Definitely most people who aren't libertarians, and I would think quite a few libertarians as well, so I'll acknowledge that difference. Okay, that's going to be it for tonight, and hopefully in this next recording we'll finish, but we might not. This is a long one. Okay, so we're continuing on the next day of this, as you can tell, change of costume. And this section is called In Defense of Jury Nullification, and something which I'm sure we all have a lot of prior sympathies with. So it says, when the law is unjust, the jurors should vote to acquit regardless of the evidence. Briefly, the argument is this. In general, it is wrong to knowingly cause unjust harm to another human being. To convict a defendant for violating an unjust law will, as a rule, result in his suffering significant unjust harm at the hands of the state. Therefore, it is prima facie wrong to convict such a defendant. And it's funny, he goes on to the issue of whether or not, he doesn't call it this, but says, is there such a thing as the righteous lie? And he says that there is, which I agree with him because it all hinges upon the definition of lying. But he seems to claim that there's a group of people who would disagree with that. And he says, none but a fanatical Kantian would say so. Well, I'm a fanatical Kantian, and I don't say so. Funny that. The only people I see that tend to deny this, and the classic example is, a Nazi comes to your door, asks, do you have Jews in your basement? You do have Jews in your basement. Do you say yes, or do you say no? And the only people I see try to wiggle around the fact that the absolutely correct answer to say is no, unless that was going to tip them off in some way, are really fundamentalist Christians who don't understand that a lie is the withholding of the truth from someone who has the ethical right to know the truth. Someone looking to harm somebody else does not have the ethical right to know the truth. And I'm a fanatical Kantian, so maybe you should speak to a few more fanatical Kantians, Michael Humer. Or maybe I'm just a bad one. I don't know. You're a professional philosopher. I'm sure you've met a lot more than I ever will. But I do think I know myself. Maybe I'm miscategorizing myself. So, in giving a similar example, he doesn't use a Nazi example, but he gives a similar example. He says, you should promise to tell the truth and then immediately lie. Agree. And I like this because even as a fanatical Kantian, I agree. It is simply the human condition that our ethical questions frequently have no easy answers. And then continuing again, as you can see, I'm skipping around and giving you highlights. He says, when I object to drug laws, my grounds for objection are not simply that I object. My ground for objection is the right of self-ownership, the right of individuals to control their own bodies. And Mr. Humer, that's why I object to you thinking that to save a drowning child, you can hold a gun to someone else's head. Okay. A modest libertarian foundation is how this chapter closes, and this is where we will end, and I need to go to work, which means that tonight I'll be mixing this together and posting it. It says libertarianism is a minimal government, or in extreme cases, no government philosophy. Boy, do I love that definition. I don't know about extreme cases, but I like that it includes both. According to which the government should do no more than protect the rights of individuals. Robert Nozick is widely read as basing his libertarianism on an absolutist conception of individual rights, according to which an individual's property rights and rights to be free from harm, from coercion, can never be outweighed by any social consequences. And that is how I read Nozick. And I agree with Nozick on those grounds. But Michael Huemer distinguishes himself, as he has every right to do, to say, I reject ethical absolutism, since I believe an individual's rights may be overridden by sufficiently important needs of others. Couldn't disagree more, and I guess that's where the Kantian absolutist in me comes out. But who determines sufficient? You know, there really are no hard breaks on those things. You could say at the extremes it's obvious, and I would agree with you. But I would say that the gray edges are large and wide and prone to lots and lots and lots of abuse. I don't know if the past few years have changed your mind with what has happened with the mandates and things like that. But just suffice it to say, here's where he and I will irrevocably part ways. Doesn't mean that I don't find value in this work. In fact, this is one of my favorite books right now. Just like Nozick's Anarchy, Utopian State is one of my favorite books, even though he comes to the conclusion that anarchy will lead to a state. I don't agree with him. I think we probably should go through that book again. I went through it long before I was doing YouTube channels. I think he did a little sleight of hand, but it's a brilliant, brilliant book with some very, very valuable arguments in it. The most valuable of them to me being Nozickian side constraints. He says, the foundation of my libertarianism is much more modest, common sense morality. Well, and I think that's a good tool to have in your toolbox when you're dealing with a lot of people. I am probably on the edges in my absolutism. He says, as I see it, libertarian political philosophy rests on three broad ideas. A non-aggression principle in interpersonal ethics, though he doesn't put an asterisk there, he needs to. And I think he's sowing the seeds of libertarians' destruction there. I don't think it's tenable. Roughly, this is the idea that individuals should not attack, kill, steal from, or defraud one another, and in general, that individuals should not coerce one another, apart from a few special circumstances. And, you know, I just wonder, tipping to the side there, if we just are having, at least partly, oh, look, well, we're going to finish it up. I didn't hurt myself, and I'm not going to edit that out. I have this little magnet thing that was holding it up, and it stopped sticking. Let's see if we can get it to stick again, at least long enough to finish this video. Let's see if it falls again, you see. I think he's confusing entirely justice and ethics, and he probably has good reason to do so. Again, we're talking about a very educated person. I think you can make an ethical argument for certain actions that might not be just in libertarian philosophy, but that interpersonal ethics say that a decent person should forgive you that injustice, such as the case of a mother with a starving child stealing some food from you that doesn't cause you to starve. Yes, you would have a case against that person, and equally, yes, you should forgive them. I do think those are two entirely different spheres. And just like he talked about the jury nullification with unjust laws, I do think in issues of juries that mitigation takes a huge, huge place. So when you talk about, I do think you need to look at the reasons why somebody does something. But that doesn't make what they did just, but it can make it understandable, and it can lessen what is a proportional punishment, as it were, or penalty, as a better word. A recognition of the coercive nature of government. He's on to point number 2. When the state promulgates a law, the law is generally backed up by a threat of punishment, which is supported by credible threats of physical force directed against those who would disobey the state. Number 3, a skepticism of political authority. The upshot of this skepticism is, roughly, that the state may not do what it would be wrong for any non-governmental person or organization to do. I have made no particularly strong assumption about these ethical prohibitions. I do not, for example, assume that theft is never permissible. I simply assume that it is not permissible under normal circumstances as dictated by common sense morality. And I'll agree with him here, and that the exceptions that he gave were really just getting into philosophy, that in dealing with normal circumstances, these do not come up. So I do find it most helpful. It's fun in just like libertarian, navel gazing to talk about these extreme circumstances. But when you're dealing with real world politics and policy, you're dealing with normal circumstances. Okay, I shouldn't have put this away. That's the end of that chapter. Can you believe how long it was? The next one, we are more than 2/3 of the way through this book, is part 2, Society Without Authority. Yay, the fun part. So the next chapter, so that's the next major section. The next chapter, which is chapter 8, is called Evaluating Social Theories. And I think this one is much, much shorter. Yes, it is 14 pages. That will seem really quick after that monster. See you in the next chapter.